I think that this is one of the most important and most overlooked leadership skills. I think that this one can make the difference between lasting impact as a leader and maybe somebody who just quietly fades out, burns out and fades away. Well, welcome to the Lead with More podcast. Today, we're talking about a very important, I think one of the most important aspects of leadership, but it's one that's often overlooked. It's one of these skills that people don't pay attention to. And to help me unpack this one today, I've brought in a co-host. I think I need help. So I've brought in a good friend of mine, Dennis Sherrin. Dennis, thank you for joining me and be willing to go through this process with me and help me unpack this topic.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Tom, and I'll do whatever unpacking is necessary. You know, if it just means case over and dump it, I'll do that. But
okay. Yeah. Well, I think before we dig into the topic, and just to put it out front, the topic is the ability to switch perspectives. Before we dig into this, though, I want to talk just for a minute about why it was important, why I felt like you would be a good person to bring into this. And to do that, I think it would be important for the listeners to know a little bit about your background. So I'm going to let you do that so I don't mess it up.
Okay. Well, I'll try not to mess it up as well. My background is I was a practicing CPA for nearly 40 years. Worked in a variety of CPA firms, from an international firm to local firms to regional firms, and through that time, I did a little bit of everything. I was a jack of all trades, and somebody that always liked to question why we were doing things the way we were doing them, and that's kind of carried over through my whole career. Ultimately, with the firm that I retired from, Advisor Group, I was the CEO of the firm for probably somewhere between 12 and 15 years, and so in that role, the concepts of leadership and understanding how leaders influenced and all the positives from the years of experience I had being an auditor and being a tax advisor kind of came together and gave me a new palette to kind of do things on. And with my sort of entrepreneurial spirit, which is odd in most CPAs, but it's sort of entrepreneurial approach I had, I like to come up with different ideas and see what we could do with those things. And so I retired from that firm a couple of years ago, and I've been doing some consulting. I work with a group, or I'm associated with a group called Transformative Solutions. They are primarily they help firms build better processes. When I say firms, CPA firms, they build better processes, and my role with them is to kind of help them build a part of their practice that focuses beyond just the process on developing leaders, or developing leadership concepts, developing leadership thought processes, and taking rising talent within firms and helping them understand that their life has been about how they're going to lead, and trying to help them coach that it's not a method or a book or something like that, but their life has helped them become better leaders, whether they want to believe it or not. And so that's what I'm doing these days.
Yeah. And that, we've known each other for a number of years. We worked together in our former capacities, and then we both left that corporate environment at about the same time. Yeah. I say left because I don't know that you ever just completely just walk away. You still maintain some connections. Yeah. But one of the things that always stood out was that we would always get into these, we're both leadership geeks, and we would always have these discussions about management and leadership. And that has carried on past our formal career lives. And, we meet at least monthly over coffee and just talk about stuff. And so that's why, this is such a good connection, because this is a topic actually that I think we have danced around a little bit in our conversations before, and I thought this was a good one to bring out. So with this concept of the whole topic here is going to be around this idea of a leader's ability to see and embrace and understand different perspectives. And
Hmm.
like I said, I think that this is one of the most important and most overlooked leadership skills. I think that this one can make the difference between lasting impact as a leader and maybe somebody who just quietly fades out, burns out and fades away. Um, and I've identified a couple of thoughts around this. One of them being the trap that a lot of people in leadership fall into, and that being they think that, well, I know the way, everybody just needs to follow me. You see things my way. Um, and then I would contend that it's actually more of a burden on the leader to be able to shift and see different perspectives than it is the responsibility of those that are being led. I don't know where you fall with that, but I always put more of a burden on the leader at having the ability to do this.
Yeah, I agree. I think some leaders put too much of the burden on themselves that they have to be the one that has all the decision making power, all the influence. They're the ones that set the culture of the organization. They're the ones that just have to be middle of everything. You know, a great example of that would be Nick Saban. He probably was that way as a leader of the football team, but if you dig deeper, you find out that's not really what he was. He did give a lot of opportunities for his coaches and his players to give what you just talked about, give some perspective back so that he understood how it was going to be best. And I think that it comes back in that. And when I think of perspective, one of the things is about the leader doesn't know everything. How could they know everything? So how do we take the the team, share ideas with them, and invite them to participate? Because ultimately, we're going to do two things: probably going to get a better solution, or we're going to decide quickly that that this is not a good way to go, and don't.
Yeah,
But at the same
yeah,
time, everybody feels like they're more connected to whatever this initiative is, and they're going to have more of a commitment to try to see that it is successful, or they're going to have more of a commitment to say, "No, you're crazy. We don't need to do this, and here's why." I've gotten both of those, and
yeah.
so yeah.
Well, that's exactly the reason why I think this idea of perspective um, is so important. And what I'm going to do here is I've got this framed out around some
Hmm.
concepts that we use in photography and videography because I think it explains it well. And there's three areas. The first of which being this concept of lenses, which in the photography world, lenses are really all about the scope, the magnification of what you're seeing, how focused you are on that. Um, that can be typically it's things about the leaders are looking big picture, which is kind of a wide angle concept,
Hmm.
and they're looking long term. They're looking industry wide, um, but they can't just look there. They have to be able to shift lenses and narrow it down and look and understand what's happening on a more corporate, on a more weekly level, and even zooming in at times to be able to see what's happening in detail. And I think that from my conversations with some leaders that I've talked to, that's a piece that they've not identified that they have to be able to do. Um, they think that their whole job is they're just big picture and they don't have to worry about everything else. But I would disagree with that.
Yeah, I like what you said there. I, So I've always worked in conceptually in the 3, 5, 10 year kind of picture frame of where for my case, the CPA profession was headed. And that's twofold because that's how the business model of a CPA firm functions moving forward and how it serves the clients and how the clients may change over time. And so you have to you can't predict 10 years. But you
Mm-mm.
can kind of prognosticate, if you will. You can kind of get a concept of where we're going to believe that the profession or your organization, your industry will be in 10 years, or even 15 years. 15 years is really way out there. Um, and leaders have to be able to kind of understand that. Um, but let me back up. Some leaders, that's not what their gift is. Some leaders are better at what we're going to talk in the next two levels. Some leaders, that's their predominant gift. And so their ability to paint a picture and bring that picture to their team of where things will be based on a set of circumstances, and their ability to share that with parts of their team that live in the moment or live in the interim is what really that CEO or that visionary of that organization needs to be able to do. Uh,
Yeah.
Even if it's not their gift, they have to take some time. They don't want to, if it's not their gift, you don't want to spend all your time. I mean, you and I both love Patrick Lencioni and the Working Genius, and we know that the wonder and invention people love to spend all their time in that, but they have to understand. Yeah, they have to understand that they create this, then they've got to give the other individuals an opportunity to weigh in on it. And so their job of painting the picture of where they are in 10 years and what they think is going to have to happen in 3 and 5 years to be there in 10 years is what the leader or the visionary of the organization has to do. Then there's others that are going to go along and say, well, okay, now let's see what we can do with this.
Yeah.
Uh, that was a long answer to your question, but yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking that because I'm a WD as far as the Working Genius goes, so I'm always thinking long term. I'm always looking big picture. But I know that it was very important to be able to understand if you're going to try to make decisions around what the next year, the next 3 years, next 5 years, even 10 years, things how. You've got to be able to shift back and say, but what does that mean today? What does that mean this week? What are the, what's going to happen? You have to be able to look at that and understand that you can't just make decisions based on that long-term look, if that's where you are. And the other side of that being that if you're somebody in a department that's there making the stuff happen every day, that may be where you're focused a lot of the time, but at some point it helps you to be able to understand, well, what is all this contributing to on a grander scale? And I think it's the leader's responsibility. You mentioned that about communicating, to be able to communicate that and
Yeah, I
say, look,
agree. I think
uh,
what I would add to that is that the actions you take today are to serve your organization for today, but those actions are made with intentions of where you're going to be in the future. So there's always some way that the actions you're taking today are it, have to have some intention to benefit your organization long term, because you can get too stuck in the moment and you serve your customer or your client in the moment when there could have been an opportunity to take another step to serving that customer, that client, but you didn't. But if you had, that would have been a step toward where your goals are, whether they're organizational or whatever. And I think that's one of those traps you talk about, and that you get stuck in the moment. For some people, they're stuck in the moment of what it's going to look like in 10 years, and they can't connect it back to today. Too
yeah,
often, though, people get stuck in the moment of today, and they don't give themselves the opportunity to have the bandwidth to see how they can take an action today that will be beneficial in 3 years, 5 years, or
yeah.
10 years. And that's a tough tightrope to walk on. I will just tell you from experience, it's hard to walk on that tightrope.
Yeah, and it gets more and more difficult, as your organization scales and gets bigger and you start to develop levels in your leadership, a hierarchy, understanding that the people that are higher up in the hierarchy of that leadership, uh, their perspective, their views you have to have a wider scope, and you have to have this ability a better ability to bring that up and down. I think of the three concepts we're talking about, the three different ones, I think this idea of lenses is probably the most intuitive one, the
Yeah.
one that people might get right off the bat and say, yeah, that makes sense. The leaders have to be able to do that. But I want to bring in this another angle on this, and that's this idea, if we're talking photography, of filters, which, those are something you'd put on your lens. The
Right.
filters would be a way of not necessarily shifting magnification, but of looking at whatever the information is and filtering it a different way. And that could be taking a look at it from what it looks like from a financial perspective as opposed to an operational picture. Now, as an engineering background, I love the operational picture. I love that filter because that's how I see things a lot of times. But, as a CPA, you would think that you'd be looking at financial would be a filter that you use all the time. I know that you were good at switching filters and looking at things from financial side, from the operational side. You used to have to do a lot of management discussion and analysis as part of audits, where you have to be able to step away from just the financial picture and look at things from an administrative side. There's a lot of filters that you can run this information through, whatever you're seeing, whatever you're deciding or communicating.
Right. I agree. And I think when I think of filters like that, it somewhat goes to who you're talking to or who are you going to be discussing this stuff with. And what ran through my mind as you were sharing your thoughts there was storytelling.
Hmm.
So we find that the audience that we need to speak to, what's going to be the best way I can use descriptive storytelling to help them understand or appreciate something that's if we're talking about a financial report and their current financial reports, and then maybe how do we tie that to a story of what that could mean for them in the future. Internally at our firm, it was one thing that we did. Uh, CPA firms used to bill by the hour. And we started a number of years ago with the idea that we didn't need to be bill by the hour, but also we didn't need to work crazy overtime. Like, you've always heard accountants work crazy hours, burning the
Hmm.
oil, particularly during the time of year when you're filing tax returns. We found that that wasn't necessarily true. You just had to give people the opportunity to suggest different ways. And so we got into this thing of the lenses. We turned it over to the team of how can you get into this, and I painted a picture of a story of how the organization may look like. And then our team got in with these lenses and they got down right close to it and they started filtering out what would be beneficial, what probably wouldn't be helpful. And it went from how we communicate to clients to how we serve, how we perform our work, what kind of tools we use. It brought in everything so that we ended up having exactly what you talk about. We were taking a lens over on these different topics, and it wasn't me that was looking at each one of these. I was probably brought in when they reached a point where they needed a decision or they needed someone to kind of maybe give them a suggestion for them to move forward. It'd bring me in. I would maybe brainstorm 3 or 4% ideas, and then they would send me on my way again, if you will, in a nice way. But that's what that when I see this, that's what I sort of see. And I probably went down to the macro because that's where the team was at that point in time when they usually called me back in, and I could
Yeah.
back up to a little wider level and we could paint a picture. So it always revolved around how we can best empower our teams to accomplish their goals. And then when I was speaking, I would speak to a client, presenting a financial report. It was about trying to paint a picture of what we saw in the financials and wrap that into maybe the discussions I had with the leaders of, with the CFO or with the controller or the CEO and how were viewing things. I could then tie what your current financial results were in relation to what your objectives were or what maybe even some of your goals. And,
Yeah.
but try to paint it in a way that it was not just about numbers. It was about a story, sort of like the way we're using the lenses in photography is a story here. It's a great way to kind of paint a picture for others of what this does. That was the same thing that I
Yeah.
did every day of my career.
Yeah. One of the filters that I thought of when I was putting together this episode is around this idea, what I call the leadership filter, is that when you go into a position of leadership, you're no longer really looking at what you think success looks like based on what you yourself can get done. It then you put on a different filter, that you start filtering things through this idea of, well, how much can we get done through others? How much can I bring this team together, or individuals? How can I help them do more so that we as a team, we as a group start to get together? You start to define success more on uh, strategic terms, I guess, rather than how much you're getting done individually.
Right. Yeah.
And it took me a while to figure that out. I don't know, when you started getting into leadership positions, if how quickly that came upon you, that understanding that you needed to be able to throw that filter in there.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things you never come close to mastering. No, I didn't. But yeah, the you have to and I guess what comes back when you're in those roles, you have to understand how your coaching, your guidance, your words are often influence. Some of them are meant to influence today, but a lot of times they're meant to influence something you want to see happen 6 months, a year, 2 years from now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
one of the best stories I have about that. Founder of our firm was a great person. I thank him for letting me be a part of the organization for all those years. And then when he retired, he wanted me to be the one that kind of ran it for a while. But I learned early on that if I came to him with an idea, and this was long before I was in the management role, I was just an audit partner. If I had an idea that I thought would be pretty good, pretty beneficial for the organization, something like that. If I just went and I told him about it, it's like, I don't want to hear that. Blah, 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 blah. He'd give me a grief, and we chuckle, and we talk about Saints football, and then move on. I realized that if I kind of had this drive-by approach with him, toss this idea out and just let it go, um, that 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year later, say, hey, I got something I think might work for us. And lo and behold, a lot of times it had the bones of what I had maybe suggested, but it had been fine tuned a little better. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I learned through time that influence can be dangerous if you use it incorrectly. But if you use it correctly so that you're taking the collective talents of the team that you have and allowing them to kind of generate ideas, because you didn't come up with an idea that's just a final result. You came up with an idea that needs work. I, I, you get more commitment to either making sure that it's a good idea, or commitment to that's not going to work, but here's why. And so it was definitely about empowering those around you to have a stronger say in that, in objectives or goals or
Yeah.
things that you wanted to accomplish in your organization.
Yeah. It builds a stronger team culture anyways. And that's what you're looking for. Cause, and that'll come into play when we get to this third objective, this third concept. But I do want to ask you about another filter, because this was one that took me a while to recognize. And that is what I call the CEO filter. And basically how that works is, you're supposed to be leading this organization and trying to keeping the spirits up, keep everybody on a positive track. And so what I found myself doing was, I wasn't hiding things, and I wasn't being I didn't have lack of transparency, but I was also trying to make sure that when I didn't talk about problems, I talked about challenges. And I didn't, you reframe the way you talk, the way you present things just a little bit, so that you're not denying that there are things you've got to work on. They might be problems, but you're framing them in a way, filtering them in a way that has a positive spin, so that people don't lose heart and fall away. That's one way of talking to people. But what I found was that when you're talking with, for instance, in my case, talking to the board, or I really noticed it when I hired my first business coach because I couldn't give him filtered information. I had to just give everything the raw. I had to, you know, just label it however I labeled it because the way I was labeling things, if I saw something as a problem, if I really called it a problem, it told him something different than if I just called it a challenge. And so there was this weird little CEO filter. And I don't know what your experience had been with that. Did you discover that, or did you just automatically know about that?
Uh, now I don't think you automatically know anything, even after
Well,
years of it. But yeah, what I was going to ask you is that did did vulnerability did vulnerability come into it when you were that thing? Yeah.
I
Or
think early on in the CEO role, I think for about the first 18 months, um, I actually tried to just paint things in a really positive light, paint things in terms of that we're hitting home runs on everything. And I was also had to own everything myself. And after 18 months, I at some point I came to a realization that that wasn't actually the best way to lead. That it was better that if I acknowledged the fact that we're not hitting home runs all the time, and that I don't, like you said, I don't have all the answers, and I had to be vulnerable to that, and I had to start bringing the team in and trying to let them have their moments and bring their expertise and shine, and not me mask any of that. And like you said, I don't think it was a one and done. I don't think I all of a sudden had a realization and then boom, I got it right. I think it was a realization that started on this path of how can I start to do this better? How can I start to allow others to jump in and shine without going too far and just becoming so aloof and so removed that you also weren't a part of it. So I think you mentioned tightrope, and there's a lot of tightropes you walk
yeah,
as you're doing this stuff.
yeah.
But
No, I was curious about that because you talked about the experiences, particularly with your coach, and I can remember the first coach or mentor I had was a gentleman named Gary Boomer. Far more visionary than I ever could be, but he was also very good about making me understand that I had to hold myself accountable and and understanding how I needed to communicate what you just described in terms of when there's vulnerability, that I need to share that because ultimately that vulnerability you're sharing is because there's a challenge, there's a problem, and the collective ability of that board or those other owners in the organization or the talent that you have that serves your clients every day can help you get through that. And I
yeah,
think it's one of those struggles as a this when you become the CEO of an organization, that you do take that responsibility probably too much in one direction early, where you think you've got to do everything, and you're still got to do what you did before you became the CEO, and such as that. And at some point, you have to recognize that what you let go of, somebody else can do better than you. Particularly
hmm
when your charge has changed, and I think that happens probably a lot as you grow through an organization. From when you start out, CPA firm, you start as a young staff, and you're assigned tasks and you're responsible for working on maybe parts of an audit engagement or something like that, and get advanced up and you're the in charge person on the engagement, but you still think you got to be in there doing all the stuff that you were
yeah,
doing.
yeah,
Um, and 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 a lot of times what happens in the professional services world is you're sink or swim. So they don't coach you out of that. They let you torture yourself until you get out of it. I think that happens in a lot of business. But I think through all of that, the takeaway that we often don't pick up on until we've been in a role like you had for many years in a role like I had, we start to realize that all of that experience was part of our leadership class. And, you know, our whole work life, our whole life is really an experiment in leadership. But it's hard in the moment to overcome those fears that we all have of showing too much vulnerability. And a coach is probably the best. That was the best thing that ever helped me understand that I needed to let go of things. And a lot of it was because I could not do them as well as I could before, or I could,
Yeah.
but also that I didn't necessarily have all the answers now. And so I had to show vulnerability from the side that I don't know the answer, but I believe together we can accomplish something to get that answer. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Before we leave this concept of filters, there was one other one that popped into mind, and it's this filter that people use when they're trying to avoid difficult topics. And I can think of some examples where uh, there was very critical information that wasn't communicated because somebody was trying to say it too nicely.
Mhm.
Because you have to have a certain level of trust to be able to just say things bluntly. But there are times when, to be effective as a leader, you've got to take the filter off and just say it bluntly, respectfully. You don't want to be unkind, but you can address it in a way where you don't address the person's motivation. You don't do that. You talk about results, but you still have to be very blunt sometimes. And I think
Mhm.
that's a filter that a lot of leaders put on and don't know how to remove it at times because maybe the level of trust isn't there. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
yeah, you're right. And you made me think back over the years. There were many times where I'll use the description. We sugarcoated things that needed
mhm,
to just be point blank. X and X is what needs to be accomplished, and this is what you need to accomplish that.
yeah. Or how about
And
this one? If you don't do this, then this is going to happen.
right, yeah,
And you can fill in the blanks there, but
yeah, yeah,
sometimes you have to say, look, if you don't meet this number, you're not going to be here anymore. How about that? That's a
yeah.
hard conversation to have, but sometimes that's the best filter because there's no misunderstanding at that point.
I think that, and I believe that a lot of people that would listen to this podcast, or a lot of people that are in roles where they're having to lead others or lead an organization, all struggle with this.
Yeah.
Because there's something about empathy that comes up for all of us. And sometimes, though, the best empathy is just to say what needs to be said, and what needs to happen, let it happen, because everyone in the end will be better off. But that's hard to do in the middle of the situation that comes up where that direct action would be the best for everyone. It's
Yeah.
do that. I personally can attest that was a part of my role that I didn't necessarily enjoy, if I had to
Yeah.
say.
Well, I want to get to this last angle, as I call it, and that is this angle of switching cameras, because I think this is the one that is so critical and the one that most people miss. And this whole idea of shifting cameras is the idea of seeing things from a completely different angle, a different point of view, different perspective. Um, I think it's extremely important. Marketers know this. They know that if you want to sell something, you need to look at it from the other side. You need to actually essentially put yourself in the shoes of the customer, of the client, and ask yourself, what are they seeing? Or if you're trying to communicate something to them, what is it that's going to resonate with them? Because I had this conversation in another interview I was doing, and we were talking about, you and I may have a certain conversation and understand things, and we can take this conversation a certain way because we had a shared level of understanding and perspective.
Mhm.
But if you had never been exposed to leadership concepts and some of these ideas, I would have to actually look at this from your perspective. You have no idea what any of this means. So how would I communicate this, or what kind of decisions would I make? Um, and this is the one of, I remember early in my engineering career is that I had a situation where I had drawn something up, a work order, and I'd gotten with the crew. The crew was very good to me, and they took me out there and they said, "Look, this looks really good on paper. This looks really good from the engineering perspective. Let me take you out to the field and show you what this looks like when we build it, and let you see it from our perspective, see it from how we're going to have to, what we got to do to build it, what we're going to have to do to maintain it." And then by doing that and seeing things from a completely different perspective, it changed the way I designed things, so that I could design things that not only met everything I needed them to do on paper, but they also worked better in the field. It was easier to build, easier to maintain. And that showed me this idea that, what does this look like if I completely remove myself from my camera angle and I go to a completely different camera? What does it look like? And I, this one I think seems to baffle a lot of people that I talk to anyways, that, they don't seem to understand this idea that, well, what does it matter, what information they need? I'm going to tell them what I need them to know.
Yeah.
And,
No, your description there is fantastic, and it applies to any organization, not just your situation in engineering. Uh, we get particularly early in your career, in your roles, you get yourself tied up in this is perfect. This is the way, this is the way I see it, and this is the way it should be done. And you forget about there's a lot of other people that they might have some experience that maybe you haven't had quite as much as them, and they share some insights that maybe make it different. And early in your career, you don't like that, but after a while, you learn that the better your results are going to be as you start thinking about how you collaborate with others that know more. Some people and this, I think from the perspective of working in a CPA firm, what happens sometimes is you got somebody that's they're good. They know what they're doing. They're a smart individual. They get stuck on something and they're just spinning their wheels. We all know this. And finally, you either check in with them and find out what's going on, or they come to you, and in 30 seconds, you solve their problem,
yeah,
and it deflates them. Um, and but you didn't solve it in a negative way. It's just because guess what? You had 15 years of experience doing something, and you knew history. You knew history. And history repeats itself. So you saw what they were doing and you thought, well, I did the same thing when I was in a role. So a lot of times that's what happens. You have to come back and say, hey, I did those same things. When I was in your role, I did those things. Now I've learned there's some better ways to do things. There's going to be a time when you're going to find something someone is struggling with, and you're going to have an answer for them that will help them accomplish something quicker.
yeah,
You have to turn that around, because I can remember it happening to me where I struggled with things and somebody else could fix it. And then same thing where I was in a role and I could solve something for someone, in 30 seconds, because yeah, I had done it 400 times wrong probably. But anyway,
yeah. So let me throw one. This one's out of the box, which
okay.
this is most of what our conversations are when we meet over coffee. They're out
Yeah.
of the box. But I had a situation where I was looking for a technical solution, and it actually came from somebody that had no background in technical anything. They weren't an engineer. They weren't, but they just asked a question of why. Well, how about if you did this? Now, what they were proposing actually wasn't possible, but it was so far out of the box that it shifted my thinking enough to actually see a solution that was possible, because I was hemmed in on what my technical training said you could do. And it took somebody so far out of the box to throw an idea that got me to shift enough to see a different solution.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've been there too. The one that came to mind for me was our firm got really involved in Lean Six Sigma processes, and we started a project to implement those processes in our tax preparation services. And so, you have to map out your existing process and you have to know every key part of the process. And so we had in the room, we had owners, we had managers, we had senior accountants, we had staff accountants who all had done tax work. We also had IT and we had our administrative staff. And in mapping that existing process, guess who knew the entire process? IT and admin. The accountants didn't know anything other than their place in the process. And that was one of the moments when I went, this is why we have to step back, share what we have with everyone in our organization, and see how they may make a recommendation for what could help. Because it was so eye opening to know that our admin and our IT knew every step. Literally, they knew every step in our process. And it was a very overly complicated process at that point in time that had been made complicated by the accountants.
Mhm.
And so it was, yeah, it kind of fits what you said. It was a great learning lesson for us in our very first lean project.
Right. And so that was a pretty serious, what I'd call a camera shift, because you actually had to see it a different way before you understood where to go with it. So we've talked about this and talked about how basically we've learned it the hard way by not the consequences of not doing this. I can think actually of a couple of examples where I had the forethought to shift perspectives and change things. A few successes, but most of the time it was learned um, by failure. So if we were going to design something or tell people something, this is what you should be doing to practice this or to get better at it. Um, if you were telling somebody, what would you tell them?
Um, the willingness to be the willingness to fail is actually key, because as you and I have discussed, you learn much more out of failure than you do success, because in success you forget all the effort and pain that it took to get there typically. But in a failure, you immediately go and look at why this didn't work, and you understand all the pain points, and you address them, and you change. You again change your perspective on how you may address things in the future. I think that comes to mind. I go back and I think about leadership, and if you're not willing to make mistakes as a leader, just like if you're not willing to make mistakes in anything else, you'll never be the leader that your team needs you to be. And you certainly probably won't be the leader you want to be either, but it's more important that you're the leader the team needs you to be in any given situation. And it sort of goes back to this thing I've said to you before, is life is your leadership class. And if you don't look at the experiences of your life, then not just your work life, I'm talking about your entire life, it influences who you are, and that obviously influences how you're going to serve others. And to me, that's, if you want to go back to what leadership is, it's about serving others. Um, my business partner, retired business partner, used to always say it's about caring. You got to care. He says, you care, everything else will work. And you know what? He's right. We try to make it complicated and all of that, but it goes back for me is about how do I serve others so that they can be as successful as they can be. And sometimes that means that they don't work for us anymore because they're not going to be successful in an organization. But it doesn't mean they're not going to be successful in another organization. And then so there's all of these keys to that through life, you've got to understand that it is about people. And so it's about caring about people. And if I stayed on subject if I went off, but that kind of is where the thought took me. So
Well, that's actually the whole focus of what I do now is this, because what you're describing is what I call character driven leadership. It's about you serving others. And I think for me, the importance was recognizing that this concept exists, that everything that you're doing, you're seeing through your perspective, and recognize its own limitations, and then find some ways to start asking yourself, how might someone else see this, or how might this situation look from another angle, or how might, do I, like we talked about the filters and lenses, am I narrowing too close? Am I only seeing too far? I think just knowing this concept and then making a conscious effort to ask yourself those questions when you're dealing with either communicating with people, when you're, ask yourself, how are they going to hear this? Or what's this going to look like to them? And what matters to them rather than what matters to you?
Yeah. Know your audience. That's what came to mind when you said that, because your audience is your employees, your customers, your clients, your community, your business partners. They're all your audience, and you have to know that. And it's not easy because we have diverse personalities, and that's part of it. But it's how our success is through how we understand the diverse nature of the individuals that we work with. And when I'm talking about diverse natures, I'm talking about their habits, how they take action, how they do things, how they serve others. If we understand all of those things, we're going to be better able to lead, because we're leading from appreciation of that other person or that client, I think. And, again, and you've heard me say it enough. It's people are what matter most in any organization. And too often in organizations, we want to not address the people as the priority. We want to worry about the processes in our organization and the technology in our organization. We want to worry about all those things, but none of that works effectively as it could if we don't do what we need to do with our people in terms of leading them and coaching them and empowering them and engaging them. And it'll never be perfect in organizations, but if the mindset is that's what's first, I think, you and I've talked about over coffee enough times. If that mindset is about how we focus on helping our people be better every day, the organization will be successful.
Yeah. Well, I don't know any graceful way to close this conversation. I think we've beat it up pretty good. I do, I think what I'll do when I assemble the show notes is I'll put these 3 different angles in the show notes so that people don't have to try to remember what we talked about. But the bottom line for me is that an effective leader, somebody that's going to have a good impact on people, which is what we want them to do, is going to have this ability to be able to recognize the perspective they're seeing things from and switch it, whatever that means, whether that's a magnification, a lens, a camera switch, whatever that is. But I think that is the bottom line for me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I think I go back to Life is Your Leadership class. You remember you're in class every day, and when you're trying to learn from every point of view, so that you have a thorough knowledge. And I think that's what it is about, trying to understand the perspectives of others, is that how can you best serve if you aren't appreciating that there can be varied perspectives, that hearing those allows for the organization to find the best path forward for whatever that objective is you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, I appreciate you being willing to join me today and be subject to this hodgepodge conversation, this assault of information. And, and I appreciate what you bring to the conversation. Like I said, our monthly coffees are great sources of information. I'd like to bring some of that to the table at some point, but I do thank you for being with me today.
Likewise, I enjoy our conversations because they always make me think, and I think
Mhm.
that's a value is that it's great conversation, and it always
Yeah.
makes me think of good things. So yeah, all right.
Well, good. Well, I'm going to, like I said, I'll summarize all this information, put it in the show notes so the listeners can have it. But my encouragement is to learn to recognize and be able to shift your lenses, shift your filters, and shift your cameras. And if you think of a leader that could use this, I would encourage you to pass this along. And if you would like and subscribe to the podcast, that would help a lot. So from there, I would just remind everybody to lead with more.